1970 Volkswagen Convertible, restoration number 2. Clip 11, Fender Repair, September 2011. Sanding and repairing bent and cracked fenders. Tap out the dent from the back side of the fender with a fender hammer. Reform the fender edges by tapping out the bends. Bend the edge flange or bead as needed with a pair of pliers. Wipe the fender down with acetone and begin sanding with 120 grit sandpaper. Move to an electrical orbital sander and 220 grit sandpaper. Move to an air sander with 220 grit sandpaper. Next, I'll remove the 3 screws to the inner headlight bezel. On one of my good fenders, I had a crack, as you can see here. The back side of the cracked fender. I took the cracked fender to my welder, Walt, to have him repair it for me. The first thing Walt did was add a support piece to reinforce the crack. Then Walt cleaned the cracked area. It looked clean enough to me. Then Walt started welding or brazing the crack. With a little cleanup or shaping the weld along the way. Then more welding. And let the weld cool off. It looked good, but needs a little bit more shaping. Finish weld on the front side. Finish weld on the back side. I think that'll hold it. I check for level. High spots are not good since you will sand metal off. Low spots are okay since you can fill in with filler, but best is level since there is no sanding off metal and no filling in. I had purchased 2 extra fenders that I'm going to use as test fenders for sanding, priming, and painting. The best way to sand an odd-shaped fender is with them on the car. So with the extra fenders, I used an old sawhorse to mount them for sanding. And begin sanding the extra fenders, or practice fenders as I will call them. Next, I sanded the extra or practice fenders with 220 grit wet dry sandpaper. Also, I sprayed a coat of sanding primer on the left fender. The right fender or the red fender is going to need a lot of work, perhaps paint removal or media blasting. I went ahead and used paint removal on the red fender, but it convinced me that I will take my original fender and have them media blasted. I could not stand not having the practice fender the same, so I went ahead and used paint removal on the yellow fender, front fender, that I had previously primed. Fender shown after 1 coat of paint removal. Both practice fenders shown after 2 coats of paint remover. I cleaned some odds and end parts with paint remover. Tail light bracket shown with first coat of paint remover. Tail light bracket shown after 2 coats of paint remover. Odds and end parts after paint remover and a little sanding. Sand the practice fenders again with the orbital sander 220 grit. Sand again by hand 220 grit sandpaper. Pour out a little dynamite filler. Pour out a little fiberglass resin and mix in with the filler, rolling the material, not stirring the material. Pour out a little hardener as shown and mix in with the filler, rolling the material, not stirring the material. The filler mixed up to a consistent color. First layer of filler spread on the practice fenders. After about 10 or 12 minutes, run the file over the material to sheet grate the material, taking off the high spot to reduce the sanding effort. After about 1 hour, sand the practice fender with 100 grit sandpaper and wipe clean. Mix up another batch of filler and spread the second coat of filler on the practice fender. After about an hour, sand the practice fenders with 120 grit sandpaper and wipe clean. About 3 hours of effort. Spray on 1 coat of primer on both sides of the practice fenders. Spray on 1 coat of primer on the back side of some of the odds and end pieces. Clean up the spray gun and supplies. Approximately 2 hours of effort. I sanded the practice fender with 120 grit sandpaper. I made a sketch where filler need to be added to the low spots. Then I added filler to these low spots and sanded with 120 grit wet sandpaper. And painted the practice fenders with a second coat of primer. And repeated the process of sanding, filling, and a third coat of primer. And repeated the same process again for the fourth coat of primer. I took the original fenders to Grand Bay, Alabama, and had them media blasted on both sides and a coat of epoxy primer painted on both sides. The original fenders were then sanded down and body filler applied, and then sanded again and another coat of body filler was applied. This is my patch and paint detail. Also, after each sanding, I washed the fender down with water, let dry, and wiped the fender down with a wax and grease remover with one rag and dried it with another dry rag. Then mixed the paint for another coat of painting. Original fenders after the second coat of prime. I then prepped the fender for the next coat of prime. About 20 hours of effort on the original fenders. Original fenders after the third coat of prime. I painted the back side of the fenders with PRR 15. After the fenders are permanently installed on the car, I will put a coat of undercoating on the back side of the fenders. The original fenders and accessories after the fourth coat of prime. I call the fenders complete now. When I put them back on the car, they'll get additional priming when the body is primed. 2 more hours of work. Took a total about 49 hours for fender work. The total hours to date is 181. Stay tuned for progress reports.